Yeah, thanks. Okay, Mike submitted a bio, and so I would like to read this. Not that we all don't know each other, but oh no, it's not in this. Okay, I might not read it because
you can skip the bio. It's okay.
Guy, it said some great stuff, and so I'm gonna and I'm really glad that Mike volunteered to facilitate this conversation, because I think that I don't know, I think we heard some good stuff today, and so I'm excited to kind of do some synthesis and figure out is there anything that we can do to help out each other in this work that we're doing. So go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, exactly. So I, for those of you who may be watching this recording later or who may be less familiar with the operations at Salt Lake Community College, my name is Mike Braak. I use he and him pronouns, and I'm the basic needs coordinator, soon to be brew and pantry coordinator at Salt Lake Community College with the Thane Center. And I am an alumni of the Utah Food Corps AmeriCorps VISTA program through Utah Conservation Corps, centered at USU. And so I started with Salt Lake Community College back in 2019 and completed my VISTA term, was able to work part-time through the opening months of the pandemic, and then was able to transition into a full-time role. And now we're seeing more developments in our department where we're kind of expanding our emphasis on basic needs and all of that kind of stuff. So this is my third food summit at this point, and second virtual, but very, very happy to be here. And I'm really hoping that we're able to kind of engage with some of the topics from today's presentations. And I'm really looking forward to going back and watching the recordings of some of the ones that I missed because I was watching elsewhere. So yeah, I guess to start off, one of the things that really struck me in one of the presentations that we watched was how much of this has to do with messaging and communication. And I think that that's been a real challenge for all of us, regardless of our different circumstances, like whether your population that you're serving is primarily on campus or like at Salt Lake Community College, where everybody is off campus, being able to communicate your service delivery model or ways that folks can get engaged, ways that folks can volunteer, all of the changes throughout the pandemic and the ways that we, in a lot of ways, have kind of been at the whim of, you know, decisions that are made higher up and still trying to kind of adapt and change. And so I think it's been a challenge for us at Salt Lake Community College because we moved from being entirely client choice, open multiple days a week, to switching to doing a pre-boxed model, to switching back to client choice. And so, you know, communicating about the service delivery model is challenging enough, but like I heard some folks bring up in previous sessions, you know, how do we message around food still being good, like outside the use by date, or produce looking a little bit sad because it ended up having to travel long ways to get to the pantry or whatever food drop off. I'm curious if Nelda or Sean, or it looks like we have Chelsea joining us as well as Becca. I'm wondering if y'all can give me kind of your perspective on how things have changed just in terms of outreach and communication since we've entered this latter phase of the pandemic, you know, as we're all working, you know, part-time remote or full-time remote or different campus arrangements. Any insights from the last year of change?
You know, one thing that for some reason, well, I know why, it's because so SNAC started out as a student run organization. Our pantry is called SNAC. And that's the reason why we never had a mission statement or a purpose statement. And I don't know why I didn't think about this earlier, because, you know, we've had so many issues with like the messaging and the, you know, our pantry is 10 years old. And so it's like, okay, well, there's still some 10-year-old rumors out there that we're trying to kill. But and then the way that I've seen over the 8 years that I've been here, like the pendulum swinging between like, okay, that pantry is for people who are starving, all the way over to hey, there's bread and stuff that's going to go bad. Everyone just come in and grab a Rice Krispie treat. And like the way that I think it's kind of swung back to where it needs to be, but really what would have helped it swing faster would have been this mission statement, or and then the statement that we ended up with. So Kara and I, wordsmithed it last school year, and we're very deliberate on like not using the word need, because it was too close to needy, and using the word nutritious instead of healthy, and like stuff like that. And so we ended up with like this pantry is for any Aggie, because then it's student, faculty, and staff that experiences difficulty accessing nutritious food, enough and nutritious food. And so it's not really, it's more like a purpose statement, not a mission, because I don't know what our mission actually is. Like, what are we actually hoping to end? Like, is it food insecurity as a whole? I don't know. And so, but having that purpose statement made it so much easier to like put that on everything and like say that in every presentation. And so I think that more than external factors, it was more us deciding this message, like this little like key component of a message that has really shaped our messaging now. Should have done it earlier, but so that's one thing.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think we've all seen when this isn't done well, when there's outreach around basic needs resources, or even social service providers out in the community, where sometimes we can end up using the wrong word or not being intentional about our language, and you never really get to see what the downstream effects of that are. How many people might be turned away, or feel like the space is not necessarily designed for them. And so like I think as this space within especially like student affairs and higher education develops, I think that we are developing a more attuned vocabulary in terms of like, how do we communicate with our students? How do we actually work with our students who are coming to us to receive services, about what their perceptions are coming in cold, and letting those perceptions often kind of like drive decisions, so that it's not quite so top down and hierarchical. But yeah, I get frustrated and tired whenever I see like, oh, like starving students, starving students come by and get like a cup of top ramen or whatever. And I'll admit, like I've been guilty of kind of adopting that kind of language before. And I think, the longer we develop these things and the longer they become more institutionalized and kind of fixtures within the broader campus community, the better we get at kind of actively identifying that kind of food scarcity. Doesn't necessarily mean having to have like a scarcity mindset around services. And it's amazing to see how far basic needs programming in general has come, even in the last 12 months. I think that I could not have anticipated how much the public dialogue would have changed around, receiving financial assistance or accessing a food pantry, or, I think the pandemic really laid bare a lot of those inefficiencies and inequalities in the food system. Sean, do you have any other comments about kind of how messaging has changed, even just like from a student affairs side? Like, how do you perceive the way that like we're communicating with students and working in collaboration with them?
I think Nelda kind of said it more the best from our end, because I think she's much more in touch with the students than I am. I kind of get more of the two-way street of between my staff and administrators up the line within in student affairs and kind of the university in general. And I'm not sure, I don't want to, I could probably answer more of the questions that you have in your laundry list, but just in terms of communications, boy, yeah, it is super important, because I think we see this at USU. As Nelda said, the program's been going 10 years and we're still having to fight the same fights. And the way that SNAC has evolved, and our all of our wraparound food security programs have also evolved around with it. I mean, it has been, a messaging thing, and we've had to toot our own horns a whole bunch, and we've been getting a decent amount of support. But I mean, with what the trends that we're seeing, and just knowing that the pandemic is nowhere near over in terms of the health and financial impact on student bodies and institutions, I mean, it's not like we're going to have some miraculous turnaround in 2022. There's still billions of unvaccinated people around the world, and how many more mutations of this thing are we going to have to be scared about and plan about and close down our economies across the world and supply chain problems? And yeah, bottom line of not having a lot of people in service level positions to address these needs, and also a student body that's probably getting more and more food insecure.
Yeah, I think something that you touched on there that is really important that I just want to highlight again is that, like, so much of this is just building trust and like establishing foundations of trust with all of your stakeholders. Like, it takes years and years and years to build trust with the communities that you're trying to be in service with, or donors, with all of these other relationships on and off campus. And it can only take one or two bad experiences to lose all of that trust. And so oftentimes it feels like kind of an uphill battle. But I do feel that the last year has in many ways kind of been a hard reset for a lot of those things. I think folks recognize now more than ever that the food that they see on their plate has to often travel quite a ways to get there, and that food is work, that the labor associated with all of the unseen aspects of our food economy and our food system is it is not without its own structural inequalities, not without its own kind of areas where things can go south. And so, yeah, I think in terms of being able to build trust, I think often it kind of just comes down to being willing to avoid the gatekeeping mentalities that are so normal. Like, if we can communicate with our students who are standing outside the pantry, who are a little frustrated that we're running late, if we let them know that the truck was a few hours late, and then like a bunch of dairy spilled all over the dock, and those kinds of things happen, I think that there is kind of that recognition, and it's easier to build reciprocal relationships around that trust instead of what is often kind of the default, which I feel like is more of a savior or gatekeeping or charity mentality, as opposed to something that's based in mutual aid and honesty and communication. Does anybody else want to say anything about communicating and messaging around basic needs and food programming, whether it's your garden or the campus food pantry you have at your institution? The other day I was sitting in a meeting and they said you should count to 7 to see if anybody has any responses. But I think we can move on to our next topic.
Are you counting out loud or counting to yourself?
You got to count to yourself, Sean.
Okay, I didn't know if there was like going to be a countdown. I was just going to throw out, I wonder if folks have thought about or see opportunity in how to leverage the legislative food task force report that came out a couple of weeks ago. So they convened, the Utah State Legislature convened the food security task force that met for several weeks and then put a report together. Have folks seen that yet? I'll find it and put it in the chat.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you, Sean. Well, I can buy us some time in the meantime. And I know that one of the topics that always comes up that's sort of evergreen in these conversations, whether we're working with our community partners like Utahns Against Hunger, or within the context of our own offices, and certainly between institutions, is how do we do our best to ensure that our programming around food and basic needs access is relevant and intentional with the populations that we're trying to serve. I think that There in Utah right now, there's an increased awareness of growing refugee populations that may be resettling in the area. I think depending on where you are in Utah, there is the need to support undocumented students or students who may feel sort of uncomfortable with accessing resources because of the way that they're tied to the institution. So, even showing like ID in a space like a food pantry could be re-traumatizing or bring up all kinds of challenges in communication. But I think the question that I have for everybody here is, what are you already doing to engage with those communities and ensure that they not only have a voice, but are often driving decisions? And what would you like to be doing in the future? So I think at Salt Lake Community College, I can go first. One of the things that we've tried to do intentionally in the pantries in recognizing that if the services are designed around our most vulnerable populations and those who have often historically been marginalized, is like, we just don't need to have gendered hygiene products. Like, gendered hygiene products are a scam. It's the pink tax. It's companies trying to make women pay extra for pink versions of everything. And I've had student leaders who have, really, really well-intentioned, try to, label things like deodorant and shampoo and all that other kind of stuff as women's and men's. And I think we see those same kinds of difficult binaries with career closets and clothing. And oftentimes that can be very, very exclusive for folks who might be in the LGBTQIA community, folks who are non-binary, and in the same way that it can be challenging and triggering and difficult for folks to navigate an institution that doesn't have enough non-gendered restrooms, moving into a space where they feel like they should by all means like have right to exist in that space and express their identities fully, like a food pantry. If they see that space is not designed with them in mind, I think it can be really, really alienating. And so I think that oftentimes when we talk about equity, diversity, inclusion, like oftentimes those turn into like kind of academic, high-minded conversations, but people don't think about the designs of their built spaces. They don't think about the way they're labeling and doing signage. They don't think about the way that they're doing outreach. So I'm curious if any of our colleagues from USU or UVU can speak to how do we think about designing basic needs programming, food pantries, gardens, all of these kinds of programs we've been talking about throughout the Food Summit, so that we're more intentional about ensuring that those spaces are inclusive for folks from a wide variety of backgrounds and experiences and identities.
We've always relied on a survey that we put out every semester and at the end of every summer. Our programming is often built on what the feedback is on there, but it's also, I'd say, more built on just our interactions with people like throughout the day, whether it's, our volunteers observing something, or we have, I think I can say this here because our, USU Extension and all of their food programming is awesome, but often doesn't translate well into what we're actually doing. And that kind of goes across the board. And my job here, my work with refugees up here in Cache Valley and in some others. So, but I've expressed that to some of them, so I don't think it would be too critical. And so it's some of this, like where we've got some really great resources, but not responsive, like you're saying, not responsive to our populations. And in the, I forget what the name of the panel was, where we talked with the folklorists about food and culture. And I asked a question about how do we approach, say we've identified, student organizations who could maybe give us some insight into what we should be stocking our pantries with. If we've got our limited financial donations, what should we spend it on? And we did approach an advisor over a student group, and he said, oh, okay, well, I'll ask my students. And it very much came back with a, why are you asking me about the food I eat? Like, we didn't go about it in, like, I don't think the exactly right way or a natural way, really. And, it got back some feedback, which was like, well, we can't really do very much about that, like in the scope of what we do. And so, so I'm looking forward to doing that over again, and maybe staging a food event where we're talking about food, and then let's open up the doors to conversations about what food can't you get. And I think when everyone expressed in Alex's very first session today, or what do we wish we were doing? And it kind of comes down to, we wish we had money to get these things that we can't get donated. Maybe there's a way that we can pitch that as a financial ask somewhere, where, we've invested in the diversity of our student population. Can we invest in the diversity of the food that they need? And maybe that's a way of asking for something that we just can't get right now. So yeah, that's all that I'm thinking of inclusivity wise. But I think that this is a small thing, but I feel like we've never put people on our marketing for our pantry. It's always been just food items, just to completely avoid what a pantry user looks like. But I've always been interested in doing some kind of project where we profile, like, there's, along the whole spectrum of like someone who might need to use a pantry, what does that look like? And I don't know, I've never gotten a student to like bite on that kind of project because it's probably too huge. But I think that's a piece that's missing among maybe the administrators or the people we're asking for funding, because they have in their mind what a student who needs a pantry looks like, when actually it looks like 100 different things. So that's something that I would also love to work on someday.
Yeah, thank you, Nelda. And I think like you're getting at the kind of the both sides of the coin in terms of trying to reduce stigma, is that like oftentimes when folks talk about reducing stigma around basic needs access or mental health access or accessing a food pantry, it often sounds like their solution is, or solutions that I've heard in the past are sort of dancing around it, like pretending that it doesn't exist, or kind of taking the sort of like colorblind approach. Like how do we make sure that folks feel anonymous as they're coming in and out of the pantry? I think the other side of that is, instead of burying something and making sure that folks feel comfortably anonymous, like how do we get their professors in the pantry? How do we get this normalized as part of something that you do in onboarding? And you join a club and it's like just normalized. How do we normalize asking for help? And how do we normalize having a broader and more expansive understanding of like what these resources are and who they're for? And I think that nobody needs to explain that to our students, but oftentimes that communication doesn't necessarily make it to administrators, doesn't make it to faculty, and so there's a lot of kind of deprogramming that has to happen in order for folks to feel actually comfortable and feel like the spaces that are designed to serve them are in fact celebratory of their experience and uplifting their perspectives and their needs, as opposed to trying to hide them, trying to say, we're going to have a certain amount of anonymity and ensure that folks feel like they're not being watched. And it's like, well, that does work to reinforce the stigma often. Does anybody else have any further comments about engaging communities that are underserved and underrepresented on your campuses, so they feel more comfortable getting feedback? I think Nelda brought up a great point of like trying to reach out to administrators and coordinators who support those communities. And I think even meeting with the students directly and saying like, here's why this is important, because food is identity, food is culture, food is the way that you show up for your peers on campus, and it's not just a triviality. Like we have this much wiggle room and these levers to pull to be able to purchase goods, so let's try to make it count. I think that's a great idea, and I hope you bring more of that insight next year, Nelda, about how more of that outreach and communication went. Anybody else have any other passing thoughts around that? Oh crap! I forgot to count from 7. Am I supposed to count up or down? Do you think it matters? Probably doesn't matter. I think one of the other things that I I don't know how much this necessarily entered into all the conversations. I'll have to go back and watch the videos and the recordings, but I felt like when we stepped into this space last year, working with the Higher Ed Food Summit, I think I was remarking to Sean and Nelda before we started that, you know, it really feels like the last year's Food Summit feels like a pandemic, like time capsule. It's like frozen in amber because it's everybody responding to the previous summer of adaptations and changes. And now that we've entered into yet another wave, yet another phase in the pandemic, yet another year where things are disrupted and changed, I'm curious if folks have thought about the landscape changing in terms of like their overall approach to service delivery. And I mean specifically, like, you know, I think several years ago, it would have been unthinkable to many Americans that they might receive, you know, $1,200, $600 checks from the government. I think that we still were stuck with this very like 1980s mindset around things like around SNAP benefits and food stamps. And I think like a lot of that messaging sticks and holds really hard, but I think that space is being opened now. In the way that there's more communication around the potential of a universal basic income, and like I think people are more open to discussing those things. But on the same side of things, we've seen shortages in grocery stores. I think folks are experiencing supply chain disruptions in basically every aspect of life. We've seen tremendous amount of inflation. We have seen challenges even in our own campus garden here at SLCC. It's been an especially warm year, and I know that it was really difficult to harvest some of the produce that we were hoping to bring into the pantry. And so in some circumstances that meant that it became a seed saving exercise for next year. But do folks, whether it's in regards to climate change or the way that we're all reorienting our relationship with this programming during the latter stages of the pandemic so far, at least, has that changed anybody's perspective on where we should be putting our attention, where we should be putting our resources? I mean, I'll give an example here. I think like in our changes at Salt Lake Community College, I'm thinking of the Bruin pantries and the network of pantries that we have at Salt Lake Community College as reorienting more and more towards a sustainability model more than a food access and hunger relief model. I think that trying to get folks, you know, money so that they can buy groceries, or upping our efforts at getting folks connected to SNAP benefits or other emergency resources so that they're able to purchase what they need, it's maybe better long-term solution. And advocating for better benefits is going to be in the long run a lot more useful for folks. But that doesn't mean that pantries need to go away. I think that like any large institution, there's always going to be waste at Salt Lake Community College. There's always going to be leftovers from catered events, and there's always going to be a lot of food that people don't pick up in grocery stores. And how can we start to reframe and restructure our relationship to this programming, given so many of the changes that we've seen in the last few years? Does it mean that the Bruin Pantry is now kind of like a club where people join and they do it so that they can learn about developing sustainable food systems and like creative cooking techniques and stuff? And does that help with the destigmatization? Does it mean that we turn the campus gardens into something else? Like, what does that mean in a post-pandemic world that's influenced by climate change and the same kind of income inequality that we've seen for years and years and years? So I realize that's a big question space, but is anybody else having like an existential crisis where they think about the programming that they do in their department and they're like, oh, like we better like retool this machine because the present is speeding past us? Maybe that's just me.
No, that's not you, Mike. As we I discussed, what was that, hour and a half ago, we're definitely thinking about that with the Utah Conservation Corps, and I think we have been thinking about that at USU, of how we can ride in two different lanes with both feet, both the food security lane and kind of the sustainability lane, because, you know, 5 years ago, this wasn't on anybody's radar, but yeah, if you keep food out of the landfill, you're reducing your carbon footprint, and you're not being wasteful, and you're hopefully, you know, keeping your costs down while keeping your students more food secure and in school and enrolled, and getting folks from a diverse population, socioeconomic classes still in your institution. You do both things at once. And I think the further that we get along in this pandemic, you know, the more and more both of those seem to be valid lanes to ski in. But I think for us within the Conservation Corps, and having a commitment to being carbon neutral by 2030, I mean, we're definitely kind of going down more that road of sustainability, and we can stay in that lane and still get, you know, with this Build Back Better bill and Civilian Climate Corps funding within the future. I think that's a really good measurable way that we can, you know, tout what our AmeriCorps members doing, the students that we have at, you know, different campuses that are doing this. That's something that we can highlight. I think it's fairly politically, it's going in the route of being politically neutral. But that's you're thinking about it about the same way that I am long term. I think the other thing about the communications part that I think we need to address too is to get our higher ups out of the especially looking down at both kind of the sustainability and the food security basic needs continuums, and not having it as a, you know, when I went to school 20, 30 years ago, we got by, you know, sleeping 5 to a room and everybody ate ramen. I think the more that we can do to blow up that argument, and I think, you know, even on our campus here, Nelda and I kind of, you know, occasionally have to deal with, you know, I saw somebody coming out of snack with, you know, the new iPhone, or they pulled up to the Taggart Student Center in a, you know, a nice brand new car, nicer than I have, and they're going into snack. It's how we contrast, you know, when they see that, you know, across the hall versus, you know, the hundreds and thousands of students that over time that we've been serving with these programs that have been getting nutritious meals and been able to concentrate on their studies and get through school. How do we play that more? How do we diffuse that? How do we keep on pace with our East Coast and West Coast peers, where, I mean, this isn't a conversation anymore. They're all into this and they're leading the charge. And it seems like a lot of the times that we're just kind of picking up the lessons of, you know, what our peers on either end of the coast have been doing for 5 years. Maybe that's because they're a little bit more progressive, maybe because it's, you know, impossible to rent some apartment in Boston or San Francisco if you're a student.
You know, I muted and unmuted myself incorrectly. That's a really good point. And I think it sort of makes me think about this at an institution level, is that oftentimes these conversations end up kind of naturally siloed. And I think that the way that it works, you know, I can speak for our own institution, but I would say that this probably applies elsewhere, that oftentimes that siloing is a result of design, right? Like, the way that people think about the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion being, you know, kind of like one area of what the college does. It's like, oh, this is an organ of the college that's responsible for this. Or they think of sustainability as being, you know, a kind of like siloed area It's like, well, in fact, like this, you should have these aspects integrated into every level of your programming, and it's no amount of offsetting it into a certain silo or subset of the institution is actually going to lead to any kind of sustainable change. I mixed my words there. Sustainable, no pun intended, but I hope that the conversations today are kind of sparking some of that interest in figuring out how do we overlap these values so that it's not just so myopic and kind of single-minded. I'm curious, I do have a couple of other questions here, but I also wanted to ask if anybody had any questions after viewing today's sessions, anything that came to mind, anything that you'd love to read more about or learn more about that was kind of sparked by one of the sessions, or if not, I'm happy to give folks back a couple extra minutes in their day, or we can continue the conversation. But I just want to get kind of a quick temperature check.
Going back to what Sean Crossland just shared with us. So I'm a really good worker bee. I've always been a worker bee, so I don't understand sometimes how to use documents like this. And I think Sean's question was like, how are we going to leverage a report like this? I don't even know what that looks like. Does that mean like combing through this and pulling out things and taking them when we like do presentations and we do our asks and stuff like that? Or what do you do with a document like this? Or other documents that we have access to?
I think in my mind, and throughout the, what's been brought up in this conversation for the last half hour, and Sean Crossland will probably agree with me, is that, I think we lost a big communication device when the Utah Campus Compact went away, where we, when, I'm going to sound nostalgic, when I was a Vista 20 years ago, I went to a Campus Compact meeting and I got to meet with all the presidents of all the universities in Utah. And I was just this ponytailed kid from Wisconsin and I could make a difference. We don't have that. When the Campus Compact went away, I think we lost a certain amount of political leverage that we could push for our engagement programs with our campuses. And I think we've done a pretty good job collaborating with each other since that time, but there isn't that 50,000 foot lever where we can get everyone in a room and make them pay attention, or at least try to make them pay attention. I would see something like that to be incredibly helpful if at some point in the near future we would be able to combine that level of participation with this food summit. And I think that's honestly where we need to go, is to have more buy-in from administrators within our campuses. And they honestly need to hear, the success stories. They need to hear of the challenges. They need to, we need to highlight alumni that have gone through and patronized our food security programs that still have good things to say and can firsthand attest to, the impact of our programs.
Yeah, Nelda, I think there's strategy in just making this as broadly known as possible, right? That it's like, it becomes one more piece of collateral that, as you send to people, as you cite when you're, asking for money from the student fee board or from the institutional budget process, right? That it becomes an opportunity for that kind of, look, we're not just making this thing up, right? Like, it's taken a bit, but the state legislature is now even considering this a priority. And you'll notice, Sean, that, Alexis's name is on this document, right? Not surprising. And I wonder, as you were talking, I wondered what it would look like to get, student government, to get this document in front of student governments, right? And kind of encouraging them to think about the role in which both our institutional student governments and the Utah Student Association might reinforce to the state legislature how much of an opportunity higher ed can be in addressing and working towards some of the same goals that are outlined in this document. I mean, you're right, not having that kind of centralized network really challenges a lot of this work, but I wonder if it just means a reapproach to, what does it look like for every senior administrator who has any hand in this work to see this document, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, there's a state appropriation attached to this thing, right? One of them was like $50,000 a year for an annual food meeting. I was like, cool, that sounds like a great idea, right? Like,
Yeah, and Sean, as you were speaking, it made me think about the USHE food security survey, and I think that that's also going to be a tremendous tool for advocating across institutions, and to recognize that there are commonalities across all of our very, very different populations of students across the entire state. And I think that it also helps us to build a case for broader basic needs support when we can correlate housing insecurity with food insecurity, with student completion rates, and to really develop that narrative around the importance of accessing all of these resources, when in fact I think, folks have been doing work around housing affordability and food access and all these things at different campuses individually, but they often develop organically and individually, and they have their own routes and paths by which they kind of become entrenched in the institutions. But it's not necessarily that there is a broader movement that connects different constituents. We see that more when folks move from institution to institution, or when we're lucky enough to have meetings like this that I love being able to sit in on the Basic Needs Collective meetings at the University of Utah, because I get to keep my ear to what's going on there. But it can sometimes be disheartening when you recognize that folks are running into a lot of the same roadblocks, and whether that's accessing SNAP benefits or the difficulty with affordable housing in Salt Lake Valley right now. I'm really hoping that having more of those research tools is going to enable us to kind of solidify some messaging, and hopefully have more coalition building across institutions. Well, we've got about 14 minutes left. Does anybody else have any passing thoughts about this year's food summit, or what we'd like to highlight for next year? I realize that seems a long ways away, but it's the kind of thing that has to start planning now. So any parting thoughts on the sessions that we saw today, or we can also end it there if folks are feeling tuckered out at the end of the week here.
Where'd you get to? Did you get to 5?
Oh no, I wasn't counting.
Okay. I think I know Summer Valenti is considering hosting next year. I don't know if that was discussed at all, but the Center for Social Impact is under construction this year. And I know that UVU hasn't hosted it yet. Obviously, selfishly, I'm rooting for that. But I also wonder. I mean, I wonder what it would look like to reach out. I mean, I would be happy to, depending on what people think, to reach out to Senator Escamilla and say, look, we've been doing this for 6 years now, right? Could this become a partnership of some kind? That I mean, imagine if some of that 50,000 could be like a stipend for somebody to actually do all the organizational work that it takes. Now that I know you all have been, I don't know if that would, if the risk would be kind of diluting the really truly grassroots stuff that we have going with this, or if it would be an opportunity to kind of bring it into the next stage, or maybe it's a collaboration. If they do an annual meeting that we also attach the food summit to it or something like that. I don't know. It seems like that probably warrants further conversation. It's just kind of where I'm ending today, is wondering what that might look like.
Yeah, I think that would be cool. Like we could be in charge of like the like campus track of such a meeting. Yeah. Do it.
There's similar things going on with the House Rules Committee, where they're looking at hunger issues broadly, but there's kind of a specific subcommittee on hunger in higher education. So not sure if you caught any of that. I forgot who the congressman is. It's some congressman from like Massachusetts that's leading that. I can probably pass that along.
I think he was just added to the Hope Center's strategic plan too. I'm drawing a blank on his name, but they convened they've got a new policy group that they've convened, and I think he's on that group. So I'm sure we'll get updates from there too.
It is McGovern out of Massachusetts, Jim McGovern.
You getting a time machine? Not that Jim McGovern, another Jim McGovern.
Jim McGovern, D from Massachusetts. He chairs the House Committee on Rules. I'll put it in the chat here.
Yeah, thank you. I think, for my perspective, working with student leaders on these issues and really thinking about messaging and programming and the kinds of things that we want to highlight and move forward on, I think, prioritizing more in-person connections where we get to see each other's faces and we get to overlap. Like I know that we have something on the books for the week after next for us to do Vista site visits, both here in Salt Lake County, up at USU, and then in the future, early next year, going into having a visit at UVU as well. And I would love to see more of that kind of on a quarterly basis, and maybe it's the kind of thing where we just continue the Google group that really brought this together in the first place, and try to convene, quarterly or in 6 months or something, so that we can try to connect more on survey development and research that we're doing individually on our own campuses and messaging. And, I know that we all have a lot to learn from each other. And that's one of the really amazing benefits and assets of all of these programs developing organically. So, being able to go up to USU and see the gardens is always like a tremendous excitement. And in the same way that, I'm sure that for the folks at UVU or for Westminster to come to Salt Lake Community College and see a dock where, 10,000 pounds of food comes in and goes down a freight elevator, and then out the other side is, unimaginable. But like we have to start dreaming somewhere. Like I wish we could produce as much food in our garden as some of the other groups have identified today. So I would really, really like to keep some future meetings around this kind of programming, both within a food space, but also kind of a broader basic needs context, to be able to potentially meet at like the Basic Needs Center when it opens up at the University of Utah, and think about how that radiates throughout all of our programming. I will, maybe I'm mentioning that now to hold myself accountable to do some of that organizing, because now it's on tape, it's recorded, so y'all can draw my attention to the point where I said that organization and collective effort was something that I was committing to. Oh, and we got some links in the chat. Wonderful.
Speaking of, Nelda, I wonder if you could send out the Google group to all the attendees today, just as like an open invitation, because I think I'll double check. I'm pretty sure it's set to like it's open so anybody can enroll in it. And so that might be a good way. I'm glad you brought that up, Mike, that we can kind of keep, because I know email lists, right? Like they kind of come and they go. So if that's a kind of opt-in way to keep people connected, that could be good. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Mike.
Okay, yeah, I can definitely do that. And Sean, can you say what you're doing now? I don't even know. I know you're not at Slick anymore. That's all I
Like
know.
right now, what am I
Well,
doing?
no,
I'm
like
standing
as
barefoot.
far as your career.
Yeah, sure. So I am assistant professor for higher education leadership. So it's an MED program here at UVU, designed kind of broad spectrum around higher education leadership. So it's an applied master's program. So there's primarily folks currently employed in higher ed that are trying to shift lanes or move up in their careers, and then some folks outside of higher ed that are trying to find their entryway to careers in higher ed. So yeah, it's super exciting. My first semester has gone really well, and next spring will be the first round of capstones. And so I would absolutely love to, both, get folks involved in the Food Network that want to continue careers in higher ed, and ideally find, master students that want to support this work from kind of a research and or kind of a fellowship perspective. That would be, something big, long-term goal that I'm hopeful we can do. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, thank you. I can follow up with Summer about the potential for them hosting. I really wanted to have a good lead on this in this meeting, recorded on tape, so that we're not like, oh, what's happening? And school's already started. So I will do that, as well as send out the Google Group invitation to everyone who registered. I don't know, as far as the sessions that I was over, I don't think I saw all the people whose names I saw as registered. I don't know who came up in Becca's session. So anyway, I think that there's a wider audience than actually showed up who is interested. So I think that could be helpful to us. Great.
Thank you so much, Nelda. Well, I guess we'll call it there for today. And special thanks go out to Becca and Nelda for doing all the heavy lifting. I know that is a challenge to kind of, herd all those cats and try to get everybody together, So kudos to y'all, and we'll I think we can just vote right now, all in favor of them hosting it at UVU next year. The ayes have it.
Yep. Isn't that how Weber hosted it? From when it was, I was like, I think Weber said they were going to host it at the last session in person at Utah State.
Yeah, I think they had already left, and so yeah. Okay, that sounds great. Great. Well, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Mike, and thanks for facilitating this conversation. We're so glad that this all worked out, and yeah, thank you all for your time. And I'm gonna do lots of cleanup and put some things on that website so that it can live on, and you can use it as a reference if you ever need to send someone to what we did today. But yeah, thank you, everybody. But yeah, I'm excited. Thanks again. I mentioned in another session that I was just like, okay, we'll do a food summit. But now I'm like, okay, this is what we needed to do, and this is good. So great. Okay. Well, Mike, you have anything else you want to say?
No,
right?
Just thank you again for all your hard work.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it, and see you next year.
Yeah, we'll see each other soon. I like your idea. Oh yeah, sorry, going back to let's meet each other in person. Yeah, let's figure out, because I think the Basic Needs Center at the U, it's next month, right? Is what Sarah Elizabeth said that they wanted, that they were opening.
Soon.
So soon. Okay, yeah. So let's keep that in our minds for a gathering in early semester, next semester.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And
okay.
All the Vistas and I are going to come visit you, in just a couple of weeks here. We'll caravan up to Utah State. Looking forward to it.
All right, I'll be here. All right. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Amber and Sean, and see you back then. Okay. Well, see you soon. See you later.
Seeing you all. Take care.